So it turns out Carl Jung was super racist. And we're not talking about 21st century microaggressions kind of racist. We're talking about full-blown Victorian race science kind of racism. And it runs right to the heart of his theory. Before we get into it though, I want to explain why I'm making this video. I've been a lover of Jung's work for over a decade now. He's given meaning to dark times in my life and he has saved me from the excesses of my good times. So this video isn't about cancelling Jung or holding him to the standard of 21st century morals. It's about truth. The research for this video has been painful for me. I started it about a year ago and it's taken me a long time to process. But after a year of reflection and rumination, I find I can't get away from depth psychology. There's just too much value in the field of research that Jung was into. But the following reveals a lot of holes in Jung's theory and a lot of work that needs to be done. That is the spirit in which this video was made. It's not about condemnation, but about moving forward constructively. In his foreword to Erich Neumann's The Origins and History of Consciousness, Jung described himself as a pioneer, and I think that's the way we should think of his work. The work of depth psychology wasn't done once and for all by Jung any more than the work of physics was done by Aristotle. The map of the pioneer is useful and their example is often inspiring. But for accuracy, you have to wait for the cartographers who follow in their wake. The point of this video then isn't to cancel Jung or to hold him to the standard of 21st century morals. The point is to follow truth forward, rather than becoming dogmatic and defensive. With that out of the way, let's talk about Jung's racism. When I first started researching this topic, I thought it would be like the accusations of anti-Semitism against Jung, where his views turned out to be a pile of outdated cringe, but somewhat complimentary to Jewish people. That would fit with quotes like this one. In the collective unconscious, you are the same as a man of another race. You have the same archetypes, just as you have, like him, eyes, a heart, a liver, and so on. It does not matter that his skin is black, which is a very nice Jungian sentiment about how we all have this shared collective unconscious, and so, despite our differences, all of humanity is at its roots one. But that quote continues with the following. It matters to a certain extent, sure enough. He probably has a whole historical layer less than you. The different strata of the mind correspond to the history of the races. So it matters a bit what with the history of the races and all that. But as we know, context is important, and the context of this quote is Jung's trips to Africa and his meeting with the Elganyi tribe on the border of Uganda and Kenya in 1926. When I first read this statement, I read it in the context of hunter-gatherers. And that makes me think of the cultural developmental systems of Hegel, Marx, Ken Wilber, and the meta-modernists. It seems what Jung is talking about is hunter-gatherers being part of a culture that lacks a lot of the complexity of industrialized countries. That wouldn't really be racist then, would it? It'd be whatever Marxists and meta-modernists are. You can read quotes like this in the same context. Our civilized consciousness is very different from that of primitives. But deep down in our psyche, there is a thick layer of primitive processes, which, as I have said, are closely related to processes that can still be found on the surface of the primitive's daily life. And this one from his autobiography a few decades later. When I contemplated for the first time the European spectacle from the Sahara, surrounded by a civilization which has more or less the same relationship to ours as Roman antiquity has to modern times, I became aware of how completely, even in America, I was still caught up and imprisoned in the cultural consciousness of the white man. The desire then grew in me to carry the historical comparisons still farther, but descending to a still lower cultural level. So I mean, even here we're getting a little bit more dubious. We're not talking about industrialized cultures, but about the cultural consciousness of the white man. But then when he talks about the Algany as being of a lower cultural level, kind of seems like this is probably still a cultural hierarchy system. He's just conflating industrialized nations with white people. It's a sign of the times, but maybe not completely racist. But wait, it gets worse. Because who is Jung talking about when he's talking about Africans? At first, I assumed it was all about this hunter-gathering tribe. But notice that in the previous quote he talks about his perspective from the Sahara Desert. It's worth noting that the border of Kenya and Uganda is a long way from the Sahara. In fact, the Algany were further from the Sahara than Jung was in Switzerland. It's also worth mentioning at this point that Jung didn't make just one excursion to Africa, but two. The 1926 trip we've already talked about, the visit to the Algany tribe in Kenya and Uganda. But the other trip, in 1920, was to Tunisia and Algeria in North Africa. And that's a bit weird because that means Jung is lumping his insights from these trips into the same category. He's treating the Arabic culture of North Africa the same as a hunter-gathering tribe in Kenya and Uganda. And that is very strange. And it's not just a minor conflation or slip of the tongue. Here's what he has to say about the Arabic world of North Africa. The emotional nature of these unreflective people who are so much closer to life than we are exerts a strong suggestive influence upon those historical layers in ourselves which we have just overcome and left behind, or which we think we have overcome. It is like the paradise of childhood from which we imagine we have emerged, but which, at the slightest provocation, imposes fresh defeats upon us. These are the people who, while the Germans were just emerging from tribal life, founded Islam and created the world's largest empire to date. But nope, they are unreflective people who are closer to life. They are like children living in this simpler, childish paradise. They're characterized as unreflective people with the nice condescending silver lining that they are closer to life than we. He goes on to place the Arab world at a layer of development beneath the European. These seemingly alien and wholly different Arab surroundings awaken an archetypal memory of an only too well-known prehistoric past, which apparently we have forgotten. And finally, a bit of nostalgic reflection on Arabs as childlike and primitive. The sight of a child or a primitive will arouse certain longings in civilized adult persons. Just to hammer this point home, when he's using the word primitive here, he's not referring to hunter-gatherers. He's talking about North Africa in 1920. So we're running into two categories here. One, European white people, i.e. civilized people. This is the we that Jung keeps referring to. Then there is the them, and this is pretty much everyone in Africa. This category of primitive then contains not just hunter-gatherers for Jung, but also our Arabic North Africans, and both are primitive and childlike. Not good. This is where things start to get real ugly, because what we're talking about isn't a cultural difference. What we're seeing is instead a racial hierarchy with the Africans, whether they be Arabic or hunter-gatherers, trapped in a previous evolutionary phase that Europeans have transcended. It's like Jung took Freud's iceberg and overlaid it on a world map and said, here's the conscious part up in Europe, and down here in Africa is the primitive ancient unconscious parts. Lest we have any doubt, he writes, the child is born with a definite brain, and the brain of an English child will not work like that of the Australian blackfellow, but in the way of the modern English person. Born with a definite brain, you know what that means. That means that if you take an Australian Aboriginal child and raise them in Europe, they will not be civilized, what with their definite brains. Of course, there's still a little wiggle room for Jung here. We can still be super charitable with this quote and say he's not really being racist. When he's reflecting on his experiences in Africa and he talks about how he, could not help feeling superior as I was reminded at every step of my European nature. We could say that European nature here means European culture. We could even argue the same when he talks about how Europeans in Africa, quote, cannot live with impunity among the Negroes of Africa, end quote, and are in danger of falling under the spell of the primitive, or as Jung calls it, going black, and how this, quote, would constitute a relapse into barbarism, end quote. We could give the same defence when he talks about the colonial prejudices like the following. It is no mere snobbery that the English should consider anyone born in the colonies, even though the best blood may run in his veins, slightly inferior. There are facts to support this view. All of this could still be Jung talking about different cultures, right? He could be saying that lower cultures have a way of enchanting us. There's still plenty that we could question in that, but that's not Jung's point. But fortunately, or well, unfortunately really, we can separate this racial element from the cultural element by looking at what Jung has to say about African Americans. After all, in that case, we'd be looking at a group of people living in a Western civilized nation. So we can't excuse Jung by saying he's talking about cultural differences rather than racial differences. And this is where things get really cringy. Jung first visited America in 1909 with Freud for a psychoanalytic conference in Massachusetts. The following are the notes psychoanalyst Otto Rank took on Jung's lecture a year later in Nuremberg, Germany. He summarizes the talk as follows. Lecturer described a number of impressions he had gained on 2 journeys in North America. The reasons for repression are to be sought in the specifically American complex, namely living together with the lower races, more particularly the Negroes. Living together with the barbarous races has a suggestive effect on the laboriously subjugated instincts of the white race and drags it down. That sounds an awful lot like a racial hierarchy, but that is Otto Rank's account, so maybe he gave it his own spin. And besides, Jung was younger, maybe he grew out of it. And so let's jump forward a couple of decades to see how his perspective matures. In 1927's essay Mind and Earth, he writes about the American love of talking, which, he says, is scarcely to be derived from his Germanic forefathers, but is far more like the chattering of a Negro village. Writing about the famous American naivety, he says that it invites comparison with the childlikeness of the Negro. We get a fuller treatment of this in his 1930 article that we talked about in the last episode on the American psyche. This article was published in the American magazine The Forum, an esteemed publication who could list 4 American presidents among its contributors. Today, this article can be found under the title The Complications of American Psychology, but its original title was Your Negroid and Indian Behavior. In this article, Jung attributes a lot of the American psychological profile to the influence of African Americans. For a start, he gives us a comprehensive list of features of African Americans in his eyes. It would be difficult not to see that the coloured man, with his primitive motility, his expressive emotionality, his childlike directness, his sense of music and rhythm, his funny and picturesque language, has infected the American behaviour. This theme of infection comes up throughout the article and is kind of the main theme. And this is the part where his racial prejudice becomes clearest, and where we see that he doesn't see African Americans as having a distinct cultural influence in a melting pot. This isn't like cross-cultural exchange among equals, but a dangerous interaction between a superior and an inferior group. Before I read the following passage, let's remember that he's talking about African Americans here. When he uses the word primitive, there is no mention of African tribes here. He's just thinking of African Americans, and he's not thinking of them as equals. He writes, "Racial infection is a most serious mental and moral problem, where the primitive outnumbers the white man. America has this problem only in a relative degree, because the whites far outnumber the coloured. Apparently, he can assimilate the primitive influence with little risk to himself. What would happen if there were a considerable increase in the coloured population is another matter. But now let's have one last quote. It's a long one, but it's worth getting in full because it really highlights how distinct the races are for Jung. We see all the colourings of the superior and inferior races and the danger of infection. It's all here in this quote. He starts off talking about how it's easier for Europeans since we don't have to live side by side with Africans. Quote, "The inferior man has a tremendous pull because he fascinates the inferior layers of our psyche, which has lived through untold ages of similar conditions. He reminds us, or not so much our conscious as our unconscious mind, not only of childhood, but of our prehistory, which would take us back not more than about 1200 years so far as the Germanic races are concerned. The barbarian in us is still wonderfully strong, and he yields easily to the lure of his youthful memories. Therefore, he needs very definite defences. The Latin peoples being older don't need to be so much on their guard, hence their approach to the coloured man is different." I mean, that quote kind of captures it all. Black people, to Jung's mind, even in America, are childlike and prehistoric. This throws any charitable interpretation of the quote about the child being born with a definite brain out the window. Jung's map of the world includes a racial hierarchy, not just a cultural hierarchy as we find in the Marxists and metamodernists, but a hierarchy that has become biology. When he writes that black people have a whole historical layer less than you, it's not just about cultural nurture. He's talking about a biological layer less. Races are a very real thing for Jung, but maybe we're misunderstanding him. There's a couple of common defences that are made of Jung's racism. The first is that when he uses terms like primitive, it's not a negative thing. If anything, it's positive racism. Okay, so he says they're childlike, but he means that as a compliment. He respects and admires these people as having something that we have lost. And this is true to an extent. But consider this story Jung tells. An incident in the life of a bushman may illustrate what I mean. A bushman had a little son whom he loved with the tender monkey love characteristic of primitives. Psychologically, this love is completely autoerotic. That is to say, the subject loves himself in the object. The object serves as a sort of erotic mirror. One day, the bushman came home in a rage. He had been fishing and caught nothing. As usual, the little fellow came to meet him, but his father seized hold of him and wrung his neck on the spot. Afterwards, of course, he mourned for the dead child with the same unthinking abandon that had brought about his death. There is so much wrong with that passage, it's hard to know where to start. The most glaring thing, aside from the comparison with monkeys, is that he doesn't see the bushman as having agency. There's no moral condemnation for the murder any more than I'd condemn my cat for killing a bird. It's a shame, but given their nature, how could it be otherwise? This is clothed in psychological language, which gives it a ring of legitimacy. But it reveals what Jung thinks of primitives, and it's not a perspective of equals, but different. He feels superior to Africans, and it's no wonder why. He is able to restrain himself from murdering his child when he has a bad day. This is the primitive mindset for Jung. They don't have the differentiated consciousness to separate themselves from their emotions. So it's not exactly a ringing compliment. The other defense is that Jung was a man of his times, and there's truth in that. This, after all, was when eugenics and race science were mainstream. Of course, the Second World War put an end to that whole discourse. The world moved on. But Jung, by the time of his autobiography in 1961, hadn't. And he wasn't lacking in opportunities to change his mind before then. When him and Freud went to America in 1909, they were at a conference and one of the speakers was the legendary father of American anthropology, Franz Boas. Jung was fond of Boas's work and quotes him a number of times, including in the Complications of American Psychology article, where Boas talked about the skulls of immigrants changing size to match indigenous peoples. At that very conference, Boas gave a lecture where, as the editor of Jung's Red Book Sanu Shamdasani puts it, Boas made it clear that there was no justification for racial hierarchies. He also spoke against the idea that European civilization represented the peak towards which other races and cultures were developing. But maybe Jung was hungry during that talk and thinking about his lunch, so he missed Boas's message. However, that wasn't the only opportunity. There was a Jungian, Paul Radden, who lectured at the Jungian Institute and had correspondence with Jung, asking him to write a preface to his book on the trickster archetype. Well, this Radden directly criticised Jung's claims about black people in 1927 in no uncertain terms, saying that no greater distortion of the facts could possibly be imagined. And yet, Dr. Jung obtained this example from what purported to be a first-hand account. It illustrates the unconscious bias that lies at the bottom of our judgment of primitive mentality, the unconscious assumption of the lack of differentiation and integration to be found there. The first-hand account Radden is referring to here is the Bushman killing his child story that we looked at earlier. The point being that while Jung can be given an asterisk that he was a man of his times, we can't put all the blame on the time he lived in. He had people in his life who questioned him and showed him his blind spots, but he did not integrate their claims, even when the world had moved on. The point of looking at this, as I've said already, is not to cancel Jung or to hold him to the standard of 21st century morals. The point is to show that Jung is not an omniscient sage who did the work once and for all, but to hold his work to the standards of 21st century science, and to encourage us to work and improve upon the starting point he gave us. We need to become not Jungians, but depth psychologists. This was something Jung himself acknowledged, as Barbara Hanna noted in her biography of him. Quote, "He used to deplore the tendency of too many of his pupils to make dogma of such concepts, and once, in exasperation, remarked, 'Thank God I am Jung and not a Jungian.' This racist element isn't the only part of Jung's personal shadow. If you want to watch more episodes in the series, you can check out this playlist. For now, that's everything for this episode. I would like to thank David Pilabosian, Sasha Canton, Thomas, and all the other patrons for their support of the channel. I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.